You see a guy. You kill him! Yeah, shoot everything that moves. Kill everything in sight. Don't let anything in the game live! Ah, yes. Violent, glorified murder simulators. That's the stereotype of what video games have always been about. But is it true? Well, no, it's not true at all. But that's what a lot of people in the media seem to think. Being a kid growing up in the early 2000s, I remember more video game bashing coming from the media than ever. And as a kid who loved video games, whatever crap my parents heard about on the news always got relayed to me. But I'm not here to debunk what's been debunked countless times. I'm here to talk about one of my favorite franchises that's been on hiatus for almost a decade. A franchise where the goal of the game isn't to fight or kill, it's to save people. And that franchise is Trauma Center. It all began in the early 2000s, when a man named Katsura Hashino, who worked for a small Japanese developer called Atlus, got an idea. The idea for a medical game where the player would perform surgery on patients. The idea came from surgery simulation games for PC at the time, but due to insufficient video game technology, at least for consoles, the idea didn't really go anywhere. But that all changed in 2004, with the release of Nintendo's latest handheld, the DS. The DS was a pretty revolutionary system for its time. It featured not one, but two screens, one of which supported touchscreen controls, which everyone at Atlus agreed was perfect for a surgery game. So, in 2004, development began, with a development team of several veteran developers of the Megami Tensei series, including the aforementioned Katsura Hashino as the producer and Shoji Meguro as one of the composers. Atlus's new medical game was gaining quite a lot of excitement in North America before its release. At E3 2005, it would be revealed with its English title as Trauma Center Under the Knife, and would release on October 4th of that same year. Needless to say, the game was a success. Well, in North America. It kinda flopped in Japan and Europe. But Atlus called the North American sales fabulous, and it was praised for not only being one of the few games that made good use of the DS's touchscreen controls, but for being one of the few good games that actually centered around it, and it ended up selling really well. Trauma Center was looking to be a successful franchise, so another game was inevitable, but what would they do for the next game? Well, Nintendo's next generation home console, the Wii, was just around the corner. During the development of Under the Knife, Hashino created a new dev team to start work on the next game, which would enter full development in early 2006. In order to get the game out for the Wii's launch, instead of a sequel, they decided to remake Under the Knife from the ground up with new artwork, new tools, new operations, and a new control scheme making use of the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. This remake would become Trauma Center Second Opinion. Now, when it was announced that the next Trauma Center game would be coming out on the Wii, there was some skepticism that it wouldn't work because the Wii Remote wouldn't give you the same feeling of touching the patient that the DS did. However, November 19th, 2006 came around, and Second Opinion launched to even more success than the first game. It was praised for most of the same reasons as the first game, but also for its control scheme which allowed you to switch surgical tools faster. Now, Under the Knife paved the way for Trauma Center as a franchise, but Second Opinion is what really brought it into the spotlight. I remember seeing Second Opinion featured in game demos everywhere, in GameStop, in Best Buy, in all the electronic stores that died during the Great Recession. I even heard of it being featured in science museums of all places. So now you're probably wondering what it actually is that makes the game so good. Well, the gameplay is what really defines the game. On top of having a fluid control scheme, the gameplay is built in a way that forces you to balance speed with precision. The way it works is that you have a vitals meter, which gradually goes down over time. The more problems your patient has, and for every mistake you make, the faster the vitals drop. And if they reach 0, you guessed it, it's game over. There are ways to keep the vitals up, but every second you spend doing that is a second you can't help the patient, and you also have a time limit. So on top of having to keep the vitals up, you also have to make sure you complete the operation within the time limit. Every patient has different problems with different ways to treat them, and you have a variety of surgical tools that you use for different tasks. Most of them involve using multiple surgical tools to treat a single thing, so it's advised that instead of approaching each thing one at a time, you try to do as many as you can with one surgical tool before switching to the next. As you progress, the game will throw all kinds of new gimmicks at you. For example, there's the artificial disease that the game's plot revolves around, there's one operation you have to do on a plane, and there's one where you're using surgical tools to disarm a bomb. You also have this thing called the Healing Touch, which temporarily slows things down. Now, this game did get some criticism from some people for this because, well, you can't do that in real life. But if you're one of those people, just keep this in mind. You don't have to use it. Although I do recommend it because this game is brutally difficult. Like, I'm pretty sure if this game was made today, the media would be calling it the Dark Souls of simulation games. But while it is difficult, it's never to the point where it seems unfair. It ticks you off, but it does so just enough that it makes you want to keep trying. But if you can't handle it, you can always turn the difficulty down. The controls are the backbone of Trauma Center's gameplay. The DS version has you switching between tools with the touch screen, while the Wii version has you switch tools with the nunchuck and using them with the Wii remote. I also want to mention that even though Trauma Center on the Wii says it only supports one player, there actually is a way you can play it with two players. Here's how it works. One player is the doctor, while the other is the nurse. The doctor holds the Wii remote while the nurse holds the nunchuck. The doctor has to tell the nurse what tools he needs at the right time. And let me tell you, this makes for some pretty intense moments in later parts of the game. I like to call this the Game Grumps way since I got it from them. But getting back on topic, not only is the gameplay good, the story is good too, especially for a medical simulation game where story is pretty much non-existent. According to director Kazuya Nino, the story takes inspiration from several medical dramas like Chicago Hope and ER. The story is told through these visual novel-like cutscenes, and at first the story may seem like a boring soap opera, but it quickly turns into an epic battle against bioterrorism. It's all really interesting and surprisingly well written with a great cast of characters. It also brings up a lot of questions about the side effects of the advancements of medical technology, especially seeing as how some of these things could happen in real life. Oh, and remember that healing touch thing I mentioned earlier? Well, in the games, it comes from Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, and only his descendants are said to have it. Yeah, definitely sounds like something only the makers of Megami Tensei could come up with. Trauma Center, Under the Knife, and Second Opinion were both revolutionary games, not only for the simulation genre, but also for motion and touchscreen gaming, and 13 to 14 years later, these games are just as good as they were back then. So right now, you have two different versions of the same game on two different consoles. So where does the Trauma Center series go from here? Well, immediately following the success of both Second Opinion and the Wii, Atlus opted for another entry on the Wii, this time in the form of a true sequel to Second Opinion, Trauma Center New Blood. Released in 2007, almost exactly 1 year after Second Opinion, New Blood takes place 10 years after the events of Second Opinion, and it takes on a much darker tone and follows the story of two new surgeons, Marcus Vaughn and Valerie Blaylock. Now, because of Second Opinion's success in North America, New Blood actually had much more input from Atlus USA, and is designed more for a Western audience than the previous games. Things like having the option to play as either a male or female protagonist were suggested by Atlus USA, and it also includes a number of features that weren't in Second Opinion, like widescreen HD support, 2-player co-op, and full voice acting. And you know what? The voice acting is actually pretty good. The story is what really makes this game stand out from Second Opinion. The world in New Blood is a lot more unsettling, and it's almost dystopian in a way. It brings up a lot more philosophical questions too, such as the potential consequences of artificial enhancements, and doctors being motivated by profit rather than the desire to actually help patients. The graphics and controls are pretty much ripped straight from Second Opinion, but it also features a bunch of new medical procedures, and with all the aforementioned enhancements, it'd be silly to say it's just a reskin of Second Opinion. If you ask me, New Blood is everything a sequel should be. It takes what made the first game great and makes it even better, and then adds some new features of its own. For this reason, I think New Blood is the best Trauma Center game on the Wii. Now, while New Blood was also received greatly and sold really well, a lot of people didn't like the new setting and wanted to see another game with the characters from Second Opinion and another game on the DS. So, Atlus's answer to that was Under the Knife 2 for the Nintendo DS. Set 3 years after the events of Second Opinion, Under the Knife 2 continues the story of Derek Stiles and Angie Thompson, and also features most of the other cast from it. It also includes a few new characters, like Adele Tolba, an African surgeon who Derek takes as his apprentice to learn advanced medical procedures so that he can become a better doctor. The gameplay, I believe, doesn't need any introduction. It's basically the same as the gameplay in Under the Knife, but a lot of the new enhancements that were added in Second Opinion and New Blood also made it into this game. Unfortunately though, because of the limitations of the DS, a lot of the features also had to be stripped, like the voice acting and the co-op multiplayer. There's really not much to say about Under the Knife 2 without going into spoiler territory, so you're probably wondering what my thoughts on it are. Well, Under the Knife 2 is still a great game, but I feel on the narrative side, it's kind of a disappointment. I won't get into too much detail because I don't want to spoil anything, but the writing in Under the Knife 2 is kinda not the best. I really want to like the story, but the writing is all over the place, the pacing is extremely awkward, and I say this because the game tries to juggle multiple subplots, but there's not much done to tie them together. Instead, they just kinda come and go, along with many of the new characters too. The reoccurring side characters also don't really do much either, and they just feel like they've been shoehorned in for fan service. On top of that, the stakes just don't feel as high as they did in the first game. I don't feel like I'm fighting a battle to save the world from a deadly disease. I just feel like I'm going with the flow, doing my normal duties as a doctor. And not to mention, the story is super predictable. Most of the twists I saw coming a mile away. I've also got a few other little nitpicks, like the lack of variety in music. Second Opinion's music was, for the most part, perfectly fitting for each situation, but Under the Knife 2 has maybe 3 or 4 different soundtracks for the cutscenes, and the one that you're hearing now plays in 75% of them, including the scenes that are supposed to be tense. It really shows how unfitting music can ruin a moment. And why do Derek and Angie have updated designs, yet all the other Caduceus characters have the same designs they did in Second Opinion? The gameplay is still great, but is it just me, or are a lot of the operations in Under the Knife 2 identical to the ones in New Blood? Either way though, Under the Knife 2 is still Trauma Center, and it still has all the core elements that make Trauma Center great. Under the Knife 2 still received positive reception from the gaming media, but it was also criticized for many of the reasons I stated, and was considered a step down from New Blood by most people. And that's how I feel. It's a good game, but in my opinion, it's not a worthy successor to the masterpieces that were Second Opinion and New Blood, and unfortunately, it would be the last Trauma Center game on DS. And that brings us to our next and final game, Trauma Team for the Nintendo Wii. Development of Trauma Team began almost immediately after the release of New Blood, and the idea of Trauma Team was to create a new Trauma Center experience, because Atlus believed that fans of the series were experiencing franchise fatigue, so they made it their goal to create something unlike anything Trauma Center had done before. So what they did was, instead of having just 1 or 2 playable characters, you have 6. And instead of just the surgery, you have a variety of different medical procedures you can perform, with each doctor specializing in one of them. So now it's really more of a minigame collection. The 6 playable doctors are Makoto Yuki, Brown Chie, Brock, Yukiko Amagi, Spike Spiegel, and Naomi Kimishima. And that's her actual name, by the way. I couldn't come up with a joke for the last one. Alright, before I get into the gameplay, I first want to talk about some of the other changes that set this game apart from the rest of the series. First of all, there's more of a focus on realism to the story, so while there's still some made up stuff, there's no more things like the healing touch. The visual novel cutscenes have also been replaced with these comic book cutscenes, and because there's now 6 playable characters, they each have their own unique stories, and I like this. They're not really tied together much in terms of story, but a lot of patients require multiple procedures, so you'll actually see a lot of the same ones in different story modes, which I also like. You also might have noticed that the art is different. It's actually by the same artist for all the others, well, except Under the Knife, and that artist is Masayuki Doi, but it just looks a little different, and honestly, I like this art style way better, especially with the new cutscenes. The UI looks cool too, although it does get a bit confusing at times. Now let's get into the games themselves. I'll start with the surgeon, whose actual name is CRS01. It's pretty self-explanatory. It plays like the surgery in previous games, except there's no more healing touch, which I'm honestly okay with, because it was kind of a crutch in the previous games, especially Under the Knife 2. Unfortunately, because there's only so much content you can cram into a single DVD disc, there are much fewer operations than in those games. I wasn't a big fan of the storyline for this guy, and I'm not a big fan of his character either. His story just wasn't all that interesting. The next doctor, Brown Chie, who is actually named Maria Torres, is a paramedic. Here, you'll be treating patients immediately after they get injured, so the goal is to just get them patched up so they can be sent to the hospital for more treatment. Because of this, it's more about speed, and you'll actually be juggling multiple patients at a time. The gameplay is kinda like a simplified version of the surgery, but you also have some other tasks too, like putting on tourniquets, setting up blood transfusions, and performing CPR. The story mode for this one was pretty good, and I absolutely love Maria as a character. Everything from her design to her personality. The only thing I don't really like about her is her voice actress. But overall, I really like this mode. Good story, good character, and not only is it fun, but it also makes good use of the Wii's motion controls. The next mode is the Orthopedic Surgery, which is performed by Brock, or Hank Freebird. This involves things like excising tumors, inserting artificial bones, and other things involving the skeletal system. This section is the opposite of Maria's, where it now encourages precision over speed, and you have to make very slow and precise movements with the Wii remote. In fact, it doesn't even use the nunchuck at all. I really like the story for this mode. Not only do I like Dr. Freebird as a character, but the story follows him helping a patient who attempted suicide, and I think there's a lot we can all learn from him. The only part I didn't like about it was the whole superhero thing. It just didn't feel necessary. But overall, this is another good mode. Well, so far so good. Let's see how they do the endoscopy sections. For those of you that don't know what endoscopy is, it's where you examine a patient's organ by inserting a device directly into the organ. How does it get there? Through a tube that you insert into an opening in the body. Usually the mouth, but sometimes another place. So, the endoscopy is performed by a doctor named Tai Tachibana, and you guide the endoscope through the body and use it to do things like treat hemorrhages, excise tumors, and remove foreign objects. But the important question is it fun? No, it's not. This mode is actually pretty boring, and the controls are awkward. Want to know how to move? You point in the direction you want to with the joystick, and then you hold A and B and push the Wii remote forward. Yeah, it may not seem too bad at first, but after 10 minutes of doing it, your arm will be sore. Doing the treatment isn't fun either. You're navigating through the body like a cave, so it's more about exploration and finding things. There isn't much variety in the things you treat, and these operations last ages. The story doesn't do much to make up for this either. Tomoe's family is constantly nagging her to come home for some reason, and she never stops talking about the path of honor. Yeah, this mode isn't very good, but let's move on. Okay, so the next one is performed by Gabriel Cunningham, and it's Diagnostics. Yeah, Diagnostics. It's exactly what you think it is. You're sitting in an office trying to figure out what's wrong with your patient. You ask the patient questions, look at them, use the stethoscope and other things to try to pinpoint what's wrong with them. So it's really more of a puzzle solver. And yeah, this mode is okay, it just needed a little more refinement. The biggest problem is that these sections aren't all that clear with what constitutes a problem and what doesn't, and the difficulty is all over the place. Here's an example of what I mean by this. For the first patient, it's a young girl that's having trouble singing. She's pretty compliant, the procedure goes well, you diagnose her, and then you're done. Pretty simple. However, right after this, you get Rush Limbaugh here. He doesn't want to be there in the first place, he won't do anything you ask, so you have to kind of BS your way around him. Yet the game isn't all that clear with what is and isn't a problem. You might say that this is the point since it's about puzzle solving, but a lot of the logic here doesn't make sense. He tells you that he's been under a lot of stress and that registers as getting tired easily, because healthy people apparently can't ever be under stress. But the worst part is the fact that you have so little room to screw up. If you get 5 mistakes, it's game over. Combine this with the fact that these sections go on much longer than others, to the point where you can even save your progress and pick it back up later. However, once you're done with Mr. Limbaugh, you get another patient that's much more compliant. You find her problems, narrow it down, and then you're done. It may sound like I don't like this mode, but I still did have fun with it. Completing each diagnosis was pretty rewarding, and I absolutely love the way the game uses the Wii Remote and Nunchuck as a stethoscope, with you placing it with the Nunchuck and listening through the Wii Remote microphone. On top of that, I really like Gabriel's character and story. Overall, this mode is okay. And last but very least, we have the forensic section, done by Naomi Kimishima, who you might recognize from Second Opinion. If you ever played Ace Attorney, this plays a lot like the investigation sections for that. You examine the victim, examine the scene, review testimonies. It's all well and good, but I have one question. What does this have to do with Trauma Center? I'm not treating patients. I'm not even working in a hospital. I can see why they would include something like Diagnostics in a Trauma Center game, but not this, and that's the biggest issue I have. I really just don't see what business this mode has being in a Trauma Center game. I thought the point of Trauma Center was to actually, medically treat patients. That's why it has the word trauma in it. And this part isn't fun either. It's even longer and more confusing than the Diagnostics, and honestly, if I weren't bullcrapping my way through with a guide, I don't think I would have the patience to finish it. So that's Trauma Team. It was a game that tried to reinvent the Trauma Center formula with some new ideas. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, but I guess you could say that Trauma Team is more of a spin-off than a full Trauma Center game. I mean, it didn't even have anything in common with the series title in Japan, which reminds me, if you thought Atlus was bad at naming with Megami Tensei, wait till you see what the Japanese names of the Trauma Center games are. Under the Knife was called Super Surgical Operations Caduceus. Second Opinion was called Caduceus Z 2 Super Surgical Operations. New Blood was called Caduceus New Blood. Under the Knife 2 was called Medical Emergency Caduceus 2. And you want to know what Trauma Team was called? It was called Hospital 6 Doctors. So, getting back on topic, Hospital 6 Doctors once again received positive reception, but didn't sell anywhere near as much as its predecessors. And that's the thing. I don't remember seeing or hearing anything about Trauma Team before it came out. Now, granted, I didn't get into the franchise until after Trauma Team was out, but I still remember Second Opinion and New Blood being marketed all over the place, yet I didn't hear jack about Trauma Team or Under the Knife 2. Oh, but get this. There's apparently going to be a 12-episode live-action Trauma Team drama series. It never actually happened, but the first episode was leaked online, and after watching it, yeah, I can definitely see why this never happened. It has absolutely nothing to do with Trauma Center or Trauma Team aside from the name, but even if it did, I just don't see the point. If you want to adapt Trauma Center into a TV show, why not make it an anime? That would have been perfect for Trauma Center. But either way, that brings us to where we are now. As of now, Trauma Team is the most recent game in the franchise. It released on May 18th, 2010 in North America, which, if you look at the upload date of this video, is over 9 years ago, and there's no sign of the franchise coming back in the foreseeable future. In an interview from Siliconro with Masayuki Doi about Shin Megami Tensei 4, Trauma Center is actually brought up. Here's what he said. You know, there's one other series you worked on that I'm always excited to hear about, Trauma Center, but we haven't heard anything about it since Trauma Team. Will we see a new Trauma Center ever again?
Wonderful, thank you. I'm passionate about the Trauma Center series too, and I want to develop the next game, but right now my focus is on the Shin Megami Tensei series.
That article was published on June 21st, 2013, more than 6 years ago. Since then, there have been no major official statements from Atlus about anything related to Trauma Center other than them just acknowledging that it existed at one point. The only thing kinda Trauma Center related that we've gotten since then was in 2015, when Trauma Team was released for the Wii U eShop. So, what happened to Trauma Center? We'll probably never get an official statement from Atlus, so this is going to be something we're gonna have to figure out ourselves. The answer that most of you are probably thinking is the obvious, it's not Persona 5, which is probably one of the reasons they won't do one now, but Trauma Center was MIA long before Persona 5 came out. You also might be thinking that they just can't do one with the technology we have today, and I'll get to that later, but assuming that is the reason that they won't make it, let's look back and think about what's happened with the gaming industry since 2010 when Trauma Team came out. In 2011, the 3DS came out, and it's basically a DS with better hardware and a 3D top screen. Not exactly Nintendo's most innovative system, but its likeness to the DS would have made it perfect for Under the Knife 3. But what about the Wii U? The Wii U supported the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, which would have worked for a Second Opinion style game or a sequel to Trauma Team. And they also could have made an Under the Knife style game too with the gamepad, or just had the option to use either control schemes. In fact, you know what would have been awesome? Using the Wii U gamepad as a tray for surgical tools while performing surgery on the TV with the Wii Remote. There were so many things they could have done with Trauma Center on the Wii U. But it's 2019, the Wii U and 3DS are long behind us, and a new Trauma Center game definitely would not be as ideal as it would have been 10 years ago. But I don't think it's impossible. It's probably not going to happen, but there are 3 ways I think Atlus can make a new Trauma Center today, if they really wanted to. The first would be for the Nintendo Switch. The Switch has a touchscreen, so an Under the Knife style game could work, but that would also mean it could only be played in portable mode. And the Switch doesn't come with a stylus either, so you'd either have to do it with your fingers, or the game would have to ship with a stylus, which would make it more expensive and less accessible. The next would be by making Trauma Center VR, most likely for the PlayStation VR. The PlayStation Move controller feels and works a lot like the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and the VR headset could make for a far more immersive experience than any other game in the series. But the problem is that VR is still kinda new and pretty expensive, and a Trauma Center VR game would only appeal to a very niche audience. The third, and what I think is the most practical way to bring back Trauma Center, would be on PC. Think about it. The mouse could work as a cursor, and you could either click on the screen to switch surgical tools or use the mouse wheel to cycle through them. For recording purposes, I had to emulate Under the Knife 1 and 2, and this is how I played it, but you know what? I actually kind of prefer using the mouse over the stylus. Call me crazy, but that's just how I feel. Unfortunately, Atlus isn't exactly known for developing games exclusively for PC, so I don't see this happening either, even though I would personally love it. There's also a fourth way, which I would have been all over 10 years ago, but not anymore, and that would be a mobile game. Believe it or not, there was actually a time when mobile gaming was just like console gaming. You pay a few dollars for a game, and that'd be it. No microtransactions, no ads, no live service crap. You just have the game, and you play it. That'd be it. But, as we all know, mobile gaming has been completely enveloped by the black hole of freemium garbage, and I don't think it's ever coming out. If this is the only way to bring back Trauma Center, then I'd rather it just stay dead. Unfortunately, I don't realistically see any of these things happening with Trauma Center, at least in the near future. Right now, Atlus only seems to care about milking Persona 5 and couldn't care less about any of their other franchises. I just feel like this past generation was such a wasted opportunity for Trauma Center. It could have been that the reason for them not making a Trauma Center for Wii U or 3DS was the fact that they couldn't have done anything that they didn't do before, and they were afraid that fans would be having franchise fatigue. That might have been true in 2010 when Trauma Team came out, but not in 2013, and definitely not right now. Although, now that I think about it, another reason Trauma Center may have died was because by the time Trauma Team came out, people were just tired of the whole motion gaming thing. The Wii was a great console for its time, and it still remains one of my favorite home consoles from Nintendo. But by 2010, there just weren't that many outstanding games coming out for the Wii, and not to mention, the console's library was being flooded with shovelware. Sony and Microsoft's attempts at motion gaming also came too late, and ended up being embarrassing failures. Motion gaming was a fad that was hot at the time, but people just got tired of it, and that's the worst thing about gimmicks. They don't last forever, they die, and any games that were built upon them die with them. And some of you might be thinking, oh, well, what about the 3DS? That console was a success, which it was, but it wasn't anywhere near as successful as the original DS. And most games didn't make good use of its touchscreen. It might have been the reason that we never got a 3DS Trauma Center game either. And it's sad to see this happen to Trauma Center. Trauma Center was a game that breathed life into the world of medical games. It showed us that medical games don't have to be shovelware, and that you don't have to be a little kid to enjoy playing pretend doctor. I'd go so far as to say that Trauma Center is the heart and soul of medical games, and when it died, the rest of the category died with it, because we haven't gotten any truly great medical games to replace it. Most people say Trauma Team is the best in the series, but my favorite is New Blood. I like Trauma Team, but I just feel that some of the new modes need some more refinement, and the forensics didn't need to be there in the first place. New Blood is like Second Opinion on steroids, with an excellent story, characters, music, and most important, the gameplay. Either way, all the existing Trauma Center games have aged like a fine wine, and I don't think it's ever too late to get into the franchise. Under the Knife, Second Opinion, and New Blood cost pocket change. Like, a fast food lunch will probably cost you more than most of these games. Although, honestly, there's really not much reason to play Under the Knife if you've already played Second Opinion unless you really just prefer the DS controls. Under the Knife 2 and Trauma Team are a little trickier. These games go from anywhere from $15 to $25, but that's still not a bad deal considering the insane prices of some other Atlus games. In conclusion, I absolutely love Trauma Center. It's probably my favorite franchise from Atlus other than Megami Tensei. Even if Atlus doesn't care about the franchise anymore, I'm still glad that the games we have now exist, and I'm glad I grew up in a time where I got to play them. Definitely go out and play these games if you haven't already. And that is it for the video. One last thing before I wrap up though, I want to give a shout out to 10,000 Punishments for a Sin. Their Spanish blog focused on Megami Tensei, and to celebrate Atlus's 30th anniversary, they're working on a Megami Tensei fan book. They're looking for things like cosplays and fan art, and they need submissions from you guys. Submissions are due September 15th, so I'll have a link to their blog in the description. I also want to give a shout out to English Strand, who helped me do some of the voice work for this video. I'll have a link to his channel in the description, be sure to check it out. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Tell me what you think in the comments. What do you all think of the Trauma Center series? If you haven't played it, I hope this video made you want to, because like I said, most of these games are dirt cheap and I cannot recommend them enough. Until next time, I will see you guys later.